Chapter 3 Excalibur.
A beardless boy on the throne of Mordred? That's the best joke I have heard this year,
said King Leodegrass of Cameliard when he heard the news of Arthur's accession. King Mark of Cornwall laughed out loud when he received the scroll summoning him to Arthur's coronation. King Pellinore did not even bother to read it. All over Britain, powerful barons mocked the idea of taking an oath of loyalty to a boy of 18, as yet untried in battle. "They'd laugh at me now," said Arthur, when the news of their refusal was brought to him. "But I swear there will come a day when they crawl before me and beg for my assistance." He refused to allow these insolent messages to interrupt the preparations for his coronation. The story of the sword which had been drawn from the stone was told and retold in castles and manor houses all over the country. Enough loyal knights set out for Camelot for there to be a brave display of chivalry on Arthur's coronation day. The king hid his chagrin at the absence of the powerful lords. He ordered there to be banquets and tournaments without ceasing for 30 days to celebrate the event. The miserly reign of Mordred was over. No expense was spared in the lavish and magnificent arrangements. "My courts and my knights will one day be the most famous in Britain," Arthur told Merlin proudly, "and I want my coronation day to be remembered for 100 years. What do I care if King Leodegrance and King Mark scorn me? Knights and squires are flocking into Camelot by every gate. If I win the affection of these people, I shall have a powerful weapon against these proud, rebellious kings." When Arthur had taken the oath in the cathedral, swearing to serve God and rule his people justly all his life, the archbishop placed the crown on his head. In turn, his vassals knelt before him and took the oath of allegiance. They placed their hands between his and promised to be faithful to him in peace and in war. Once the coronation ceremony was over, and Arthur had been acclaimed by the people of Camelot, it was time for the tournament to begin. It was Arthur himself, mounted on a fine charger, who was the first to ride up and down the lists and challenge all comers. His foster brother, Kay, took up the challenge eagerly. "It would be a fine thing if I could unseat Arthur and so win my spurs today," he thought. But Arthur was more than a match for Kay. He belaboured Kay and toppled him off his horse. Kay leapt cheerfully to his feet. "Well done, Arthur," he cried, showing that he bore no resentment for his defeat. "Now it is time for the king to retire to his royal pavilion and leave the field to his subjects. What is the prize for the winner of this tournament?" "A knighthood! By my royal oath, I swear to knight the winner." So saying, Arthur rode off to his pavilion and took his seat there. Inwardly, he felt rather sad at having to leave the fighting, but it was all part of the mixed joy and sadness of being a king. In future, he would have to realize he could not joust and tilt freely as Kay could. He had a responsibility to his people. Part 2. Kay meets disaster. Kay was anxious to win his spurs, so all day he fought like a man inspired. Towards the end of the tournament, his sword arm was weary, and his armour showed several fearful rents. But he was still undefeated. Only one other knight could say the same. This was an unknown knight, whose shield bore no crest. Kay did not recognise his horse, or his armour. It occurred to him that this might be a spy sent by Pellinore or Mark of Cornwall. He resolved to challenge the unknown in the last round of the tournament and unmask him. The unknown would not put up his visor to answer Kay's challenge. His voice was muffled and soft as he replied, "I have waited all day to fight with you, Kay, brother of Arthur, for I think you are an opponent worthy of my steel." With these words, the unknown spurred his horse and galloped forward. Kay galloped towards the unknown at full speed, but although he dealt the unknown a mighty blow with his lance, which would have rocked a lesser man in the saddle, his new opponent scarcely seemed to feel it. Kay's second charge was even more unsuccessful, for the unknown's lance penetrated one of the rents in his armour and pierced his leg. The pain made Kay faint and dizzy. He set his teeth and aimed a blow wildly back at his enemy. At the third charge, Kay could no longer survive the savage onslaught, and the impact of the unknown's fierce blows, he tottered in the saddle and tumbled heavily to the ground. A groan went up from the crowd, for Kay was popular, and nothing was known about this stranger. Arthur himself hated to see his foster brother bite the dust at the hand of an anonymous knight. But he had a duty to fulfill. He faced the unknown graciously and asked him to put up his visor. The face which confronted him belonged to no spy from Leodegrance or Pelennor. He saw a young and dazzlingly handsome man, scarcely older than himself, who smiled frankly at the king. "Come, admit you had expected someone much older," said the unknown, laughing, "or a monster, or perhaps King Leodegrance of Cameliard himself. But I have no high position or formidable reputation. I am simply a young soldier of fortune who has come to your court, Arthur Pendragon, because the idea of a gallant young king facing his enemies on all sides appealed to me. I am Lancelot, and I lay my sword at your service." This honest speech pleased Arthur. He had need of men like this. He was going to win back the lands which Mordred had sacrificed to the Saxons. Without hesitation, he accepted Lancelot's offer of service and bade him kneel to receive the knighthood which was the prize of the tournament. Thus Sir Lancelot was the first knight whom Arthur created in his reign. The second was naturally Sir Kay, for Arthur had no desire to annoy his touchy foster brother by preferring a stranger to him. In spite of his defeat at the tournament, Kay received the prized accolade with the flat of Arthur's sword. Part 3. The Treachery of King Pelennor. Scarcely were the 30 days of feasting over, than grave news was brought to the king. An exhausted messenger, dusty from a long, hectic ride, and blood-stained from a wound in the arm, flung himself at the king's feet. "My liege, save us from the Saxons," he panted. "The south of Britain groans under the heel of the invader, and we shall all die of starvation if we survive the massacre." Sir Kay bent down and examined the body stretched at Arthur's feet. His eyes narrowed when he saw the crest on the fellow's jerkin. "This is one of Pellennor's men," he said in Arthur's ear. "I know that crest only too well. Have a care, Arthur, for I suspect a trap." Arthur raised the man to his knees. There was no doubt that he was genuinely exhausted by a long ride and weakened by a wound. But why should Pellennor's men come to Arthur for help? Arthur decided the surprise attack would help him get the truth. "Miserable spy," he said angrily. "Why do you come to me with this lying tale? I can see that you are one of Pellennor's ruffians. Pelennor can look after his own lands, since he will not take the oath of allegiance to me. A day or two in my dungeons will teach you to try and trap Arthur Pendragon." The man groaned. "My liege," he said faintly, "have mercy on me. It is true, I am one of Pelinor's vassals, or rather, I was. But that base king is even now making a treaty with the invaders, which will give them all the lands they want in the south. Now you see why I cannot appeal to Pellinor for help." Arthur's face darkened in anger. So, Pellinor, like Mordred, was playing the British chiefs false by making private arrangements with the Saxons. It was time to put an end to this state of affairs and depose Pellinor from the throne which he occupied so unworthily. He ordered the heralds to blow their trumpets from the battlements. It was war. A week later, with a head held high, Arthur rode out from Camelot on a magnificent white horse at the head of his men. It was the first time he had led his people in battle, and he prayed that he might prove a leader worthy of them. Along the road, the burnt hayricks and ruined buildings testified to the ruthless Saxon raids and the treachery of Pellinor. Old men and women crouched in the ditches, clutching the few possessions which were left to them. Children wept and clung to their mothers' skirts. Some of them, who recognized Arthur, cried out with joy and acclaimed him as the saviour of their country. The young king's heart leapt to hear their cries. "I have won the affection of the people," he thought. "Now I must win their admiration by fighting like a king." They were now deep in the heart of Pellinor's country. Arthur took Lancelot's advice and decided to march on Pellinor's castle from two sides. Lancelot, with 50 of the boldest knights, was to attack from the west. Arthur was to lead the main body of the army by the front road. From his battlements, Pellinor watched them approach. Once again he refused to take the boy king, as he derisively called him, seriously. It was a mistake which was to cost him dear. He took no particular trouble with the defences of the castle. He did not even bother to send word to his allies, the Saxons, who were encamped over the hill, out of sight of the approaching army. Pellinor idled away the hours in his great hall, composing songs in his honour of his victory over Arthur. The fact that this victory had not yet happened did not worry Pellinor at all. The cries of the Saxons and the clash of arms took Pellinor completely by surprise. Rushing to the window, he saw that his allies, the so-called Terror of the South, were being put to the sword by the despised boy king. The invaders had no time to make plans before Arthur and his army were upon them. In a panic, the Saxons thought only of flight and the safety of their ships. Pellinor could see the scurrying forms of the leaders heading for the coast. Behind them raced Arthur, brandishing his sword and decimating their broken ranks. "Man the walls!" shouted King Pellinor. "We have no time to lose if we are to survive this onslaught. I can see that Arthur Pendragon is a general to be reckoned with." "My liege," said the king's squire apologetically, "we have scarcely a fighting force in the castle. Most of the best men were given leave to go back to their homes after the treaty with the Saxons." Pellinor frowned. It was too true. After a moment, he smiled. If he could not save himself by fair means, then he would try foul. He sent for his chief herald. An hour later, Arthur, encamped outside the castle of Pellinor, received a message from the king. It was extremely moderate and conciliatory, unlike the insolent messages which he had sent to Arthur at his coronation. Pellinor suggested the best way for kings to settle their differences was by private combat. Thus much unnecessary bloodshed could be avoided. Pellinore appealed to Arthur's good sense and statesmanship. It was a subtle appeal, for Arthur was flattered by the implication that he was old enough to think other methods of settling squabbles rather crude. He had no reason to doubt Pellinore's good intentions. Gladly he accepted the challenge, and, leaving his men at a distance, he rode forth to meet Pellinore alone. He found the rebel king sitting proudly astride his charger at the foot of the castle. Arthur felt a moment's doubt when he saw how close the ranks of Pellinore's knights stood, and he remembered how far off he had led his own army. However, he rode forward confidently to meet Pellinore's challenge. The fight between the two kings was long and bitter. In the course of it, Arthur sustained 2 deep wounds, and Pellinore himself was wounded in the shoulder by Arthur's spear. But Arthur managed to hold his own, until the very moment when the black-hearted Pellinore gave a secret signal, and the ranks of his knights plunged forward to overwhelm the young king. In the first moment of this treacherous attack, Arthur felt the strong sword which he had drawn from the stone splinter into 1,000 pieces. Then he was dragged from his horse and hurled to the ground by a screaming mob of swordsmen. In the general melee, what chance did Arthur stand, alone against so many enemies? He'd given himself up for lost, when suddenly the blows ceased, and his assailants turned to defend themselves against a new attack. Arthur had not the strength to pick himself off the ground, for he was wounded in every limb, and his armour had been torn from him. Nevertheless, from the ground, he could see to his joy Sir Lancelot and his 50 men striking blow upon blow against Pellinore and his false knights. Later, Arthur learned that Lancelot had come upon the scene just in time to see the king fall before the treacherous charge of Pellinore's men, and had come at full gallop to rescue his liege lord. Even so, he'd only managed by a miracle to rescue Arthur from death. The fight between Sir Lancelot and King Pellinore was short and bloody. In a few moments the evil king lay on the ground, pierced at the heart. A fitting end for one who had broken the sacred rules of chivalry. Sir Lancelot himself bore the wounded king back to his own lines, and saw to it that Arthur's wounds were tended. Meanwhile, Pellinore's followers, seeing their master slain, surrendered to Sir Lancelot, and forswore the Saxon alliance. The drawbridge was lowered, and Arthur carried inside at the head of his men. Part 4. The Lady of the Lake. It was many weeks before Arthur's wounds were fully healed, and, during his convalescence, the king was often worried by the fact that the sword, which he had drawn from the stone, had been broken in a charge of the rebels. It seemed an evil omen. When the day came for him to mount his horse again and return to Camelot at the head of the army, his heart was heavy. At his side the borrowed sword hung in the borrowed scabbard, a perpetual reminder of his loss. Suddenly the wizard Merlin appeared at Arthur's side, one of the silent, mysterious appearances which he loved to make. "Tell Sir Lancelot to lead your men back to Camelot, my lord," said Merlin in Arthur's ear. "Then follow me alone, and I will lead you where you will find another sword, mightier than the one which was broken in battle with the treacherous hosts of Pellinore." Arthur needed no second invitation. A swift command to Lancelot, and he was ready and willing to follow the wizard. Merlin took him on a long journey. The paths they took were lonely, and their way seemed to lie through many waste places. They passed through great forests without meeting a single traveller. Arthur suspected the wizard was deliberately leading him by a winding route to prevent him remembering the way. When the wizard swore him to an oath of secrecy, Arthur replied there was no need, because never in his life would he find such a tortuous route again. Yet you are destined to find this path once more during your lifetime, replied Merlin. At the end of your life, I have seen it written in your fate. Then he pointed ahead of him. What strange and wonderful sight was this? A great lake, like a huge looking glass, stretched out as far as the eye could see. There was not a human being to be seen. No birds sang, no animals scampered across their path. Thick rushes fringed the edge of the lake, where a solitary rowing boat was drawn up. But this was not the sight which made Arthur hold his breath in fear and amazement, for, out in the middle of the lake itself, extended an arm, clothed in a white sleeve and grasping the hilt of a sword. Where there should have been a shoulder, the arm disappeared into the bosom of the lake. Arthur crossed himself. What trick of the devil is this, Merlin? He asked roughly. This is no trick of the devil, replied the wizard. The Lady of the Lake herself is offering you the most powerful sword in Britain, Excalibur itself. The history of Excalibur is as old as the history of Britain. No one knows where that magic weapon first was forged, for the Lady of the Lake preserves her secret. But every century or so, she lends it to a favoured mortal. Take it, Arthur, for it is yours during your lifetime. Without hesitation, the young king stepped into the rowing boat and rowed speedily towards the white arm which glimmered in the middle of the lake. His imagination was fired by the thought of this powerful weapon, which would replace the sword drawn from the stone. When he reached the arm, he drew the sword gently from its grasp. Immediately, the arm sank below the waves, and, however hard he looked, Arthur could not see anything below the surface of the water. Thoughtfully, he rowed back to Merlin and showed him the sword. See to it that you are worthy of this famous blade, said the wizard. Also, see to it that you guard the scabbard well. It is said to have magic powers, which protect the wearer from wounds. Arthur felt most grateful towards the aged wizard, having brought him to this lonely place, and helped him obtain the sword Excalibur. He thanked him from his heart. But the wizard disclaimed his thanks, and explained he had acted on the instructions of the Lady of the Lake herself, who had wished to repay an old debt of gratitude to his father, Uther Pendragon. Arthur discovered that there were two inscriptions, one on each side of the blade. Keep me, and cast me away. He asked the wizard laughingly whether he should immediately cast the blade back into the lake. The wizard did not smile. The time has not yet come to cast away Excalibur, he replied gravely. But when you feel the hour of your death is upon you, make your way back to this lake and give back Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. I swear it, said the king. But the hour of his death seemed a long way off to Arthur, and now that he had got a new sword, he was impatient to return to Camelot. Bidding a hasty goodbye to the wizard, he leapt on his horse and set off at a gallop back through the forest. Merlin watched him go with foreboding. He feared that the young king would meet some strange adventures before he reached Camelot, for the wizard's spells had warned him that Queen Morgan le Fay was already plotting to overthrow Arthur. However, Arthur had not waited to hear his advice, and, somewhat hurt, Merlin decided to let him go his own way and learn by his own mistakes. Part 4. Arthur falls into a trap. I am the finest king in Britain now, thought Arthur conceitedly as he rode along. I have defeated the Saxons, vanquished King Pellinore. Well, perhaps Lancelot did help a little, but it was in fact me who beat him. And now I have got Excalibur. Arthur whistled a song of triumph to himself, but his pride was soon to have a fall. A young girl, in a state of great distress, stopped him by the wayside and begged for his assistance. Arthur gallantly promised to help her. Perhaps if he had thought back to the treachery of King Pellinore, which had fooled him, he might have been more wary now. But Arthur was convinced that no one could teach him anything. He hoisted the girl onto his horse and rode with her back to her house. He listened to the tale which he poured into his sympathetic ear. It was a confused story of a wicked stepmother and a lost inheritance, which Arthur had some difficulty unravelling. Several times the girl even seemed to contradict herself, but Arthur put this down to her distress. He vowed to help her recover her inheritance, even if it meant fighting every stepfather in Britain single-handedly. The girl was profuse in her gratitude and suggested that Arthur should have a meal before setting out to brave her stepfather in his castle. The day had been long, and Arthur felt weary. He saw no objection to some bread and a glass of mead to refresh himself. Yet the look of sly satisfaction on the girl's face should have warned him against drinking out the goblet which she gave him. Sleep overcame Arthur as soon as he had drained the goblet. No sooner had his eyelids closed than the innocent-looking girl underwent an amazing transformation. In a few moments, the girl Arthur met had disappeared, and Morgan le Fay herself stood there in her place, smiling cruelly over the helpless form of the king. Morgan le Fay's arts enabled her to disguise herself in various ways without difficulty, and she had adopted the youthful appearance of a country girl in order to lure Arthur into her power. Without losing a moment, she seized the scabbard of Excalibur and, thrusting it under her cloak, stole silently away, leaving Arthur to sleep off the effects of the drugs she had given him. It was several hours before Arthur stirred and woke. His head ached abominably, and he had no recollection of how he had come to lie in this deserted house. Dragging himself painfully to his feet, he made his way out and straight to his horse. As he rode towards Camelot, memory came back to him slowly. Arthur groaned in horror as he realized he had been drugged and duped and, worse still, robbed. For Excalibur was now roped to his side by a common cord, and the magic scabbard was gone. Morgan le Fay, he thought. It must have been her plan to steal the scabbard, and so leave me vulnerable to the wounds of my enemies. The king cursed himself, having neglected the advice of Merlin, and vowed to pay more attention to the wizard's warnings in future. He was also puzzled why Morgan le Fay, having taken the scabbard, left the sword. The ways of magic were strange and mysterious to him, and he did not know that the Lady of the Lake was actually the most powerful witch in Britain. Her magic was considerably stronger than that of Queen Morgan le Fay, who was half witch and half woman. It would need all Morgan le Fay's most deep-laid plots to steal the famous sword Excalibur, as future events were to prove. In the meantime, the Witch Queen had succeeded in half her plan to overthrow Arthur. She had stolen the scabbard and made sure that he could be wounded and killed like other mortals.